Hey everyone, thanks for checking out part 3 of my NES Retrospective, where I'm going through the entire NES library. Well, for now I'm going through everything. We'll see if I change that later on and just do the notable titles like I do for other games, but yeah, right now everything. So, year 3, we're covering 1987. If you haven't seen 85 or 86, go back and check those out. And this is the year where things really pick up with the NES. A ton of third-party games, some really notable franchises starting, just a whole bunch of stuff here. If you dig my content, please subscribe. It really helps me. And let's get right into 1987. There were 53 titles released for the NES this year, and we got the rest of Nintendo's black box games. But first, we're starting off with a Capcom title, the port of the arcade game Trojan. This is a lesser-known Capcom game, but still a pretty interesting one that shows off what we can come to expect from the developer. The game is a side-scrolling action title set in a post-apocalyptic future world. It's based on the arcade version, but features quite a few differences, including new power-ups and hidden rooms. There's also a 2-player fighting mode where player 2 controls an enemy and faces off against the first player. Moving into March, we get the last 3 of Nintendo's black box games, starting with Pro Wrestling. This game is basically a precursor to the Fire Pro Wrestling series, being designed by Matsuo Masuda, who would go on to work on those games. The game has a single-player and 2-player modes. It features 6 fictional wrestlers from around the world, and is probably the best wrestling game of this time. After that was Slalom, a skiing game developed by Rare and originally released for the Nintendo Versus arcade system. The goal of the game is to ski around flags in order to maintain speed and clear each course. There are 24 courses set over 3 mountains. And the last black box game, Volleyball. It's a port of the Nintendo arcade game Volleyball, a 6-on-6 game featuring both men's and women's teams from 9 countries. Following that is Russian Attack, a port of the Konami arcade game in which a US covert soldier breaks into a base in order to destroy a secret weapon. The game features 6 stages, including 2 new stages created just for the console release. The player starts with just a knife and mostly uses melee attacks to take out enemies, but can pick up guns and other weapons along the way. This NES version also added a simultaneous 2-player mode. Another arcade game right after that, Track and Field. This is a port of another Konami arcade game. Track and Field is an Olympic-style game with a couple events, including a 100-meter dash, the long jump, hurdles, the javelin throw, skeet shooting, triple jump, archery, and high jump events. Following that, another arcade port, Burger Time. One of Data East's arcade games that has the player controlling the chef Peter Pepper, who walks along a series of platforms, dropping down ingredients in order to make burgers. All this while avoiding or taking out enemies. The game has 6 different stage layouts. And finally, we get to one of the games I have left in my collection, and a great one at that, Konami's Castlevania. For most fans, this was the beginning of one of Konami's biggest franchises. The original Castlevania game includes the vampire hunter Simon Belmont, who uses his whip to take out all variety of universal monsters on his way through Dracula's castle to take out the vampire himself. The major elements of the series are all defined here, including the key enemies and bosses, jumping and whip mechanics, sub-weapons, and platforming challenges. Overall, a great start for the series, and a game still worth checking out, just a ton of fun. Following that is SNK's Ikari Warriors, a port of their arcade top-down co-op shooter that's similar to last year's Commando. The game features 2 soldiers trying to make their way through enemy territory, taking on soldiers and tanks to the village of Ikari. The original arcade game used a rotary joystick, which really helped with the controls. The NES version is a pretty bad port. Obviously it can't do that rotating stuff, and doesn't feel that special, but it's an early attempt at trying to bring these rotary games over to the NES. And another classic NES title after that, and their first that's not in a black box, Kid Icarus. Nintendo's Cupid-like hero Pit makes his debut in this tough platformer that's often described as a more linear Metroid. The game sees Pit traveling through the underworld to the sky world, searching for 3 treasures Medusa has stolen from the goddess Palutena. There are vertical and horizontal scrolling stages, as well as stages where Pit can fly near the end of the game. Uniquely, the design of the vertical stages allow the player to loop around the screen for a more complex level structure. The game is really tough though, and not a great experience, but really notable for the introduction of Pit. Following that, a kind of sequel to a Tecmo arcade game, Mighty Bomb Jack. This strange sequel or update to the original arcade game Bomb Jack adds 16 new platforming levels, each ending in a palace room that's taken from the original game. So now, kind of the first part of a story we'll get to later on, but yeah, we're going to start talking about the Family Fun Fitness Pad, which becomes a much more interesting story later on in this retrospective, but for now it releases with its first game, Athletic World. On July 12th, Bandai released the Family Fun Fitness Package, a new pad controller bundled with the game Athletic World. The original release of the game Athletic World was bundled with the pad controller, which featured two sides. One with 12 pads that the player could run and stomp on in order to control their character in the game, and a second side which featured 8 pads in a different configuration. Athletic World is a fitness game with 5 different courses and 3 difficulties. In each course, the player runs and jumps to avoid obstacles. When the Family Fun Fitness bundle was replaced with the Power Pad, the game was re-released. Though the game is still the same, the box now no longer has the Family Fun Fitness logo on it. So a box and label variant there. And next up, the next game in my collection, and one definitely worth knowing about, Tecmo's Rygar. Tecmo's NES follow-up to the arcade game of the same name is a vastly different experience. Instead of the standard action platformer that the arcade game was, the NES gets its first open-world side-scrolling action game with RPG elements, a genre that would decades later become known as Metroidvanias. The game has the player controlling the resurrected warrior Rygar, who's equipped with his disc armor, a spinning disc weapon that he uses to take out enemies. He can also cast 3 helpful spells that power you up, attack enemies, or heal them. While exploring the world, the player will have to find weapon and armor upgrades, useful items, and level up by defeating enemies and increasing your tone and last stats. It's a really fun game, I do recommend it, and like Mighty Bomb Jack, an example of someone taking their arcade game and making something completely different from it. Speaking of arcade games, another Capcom port, Section Z. This is a port of Capcom's horizontal shooter that changes up design quite a bit from the arcade version as well. Section Z has the player flying and shooting through 3 different stages made up of 20 sections. At the end of each section, the player must choose a pass, though there's some replayability here. If you want to see the different sections in each stage. The player can shoot in either direction, find weapon power-ups, and use some special attacks. Overall, the design makes the game really interesting, using just bite-sized stages to create a maze. Following that, a port of Tecmo's arcade game Solomon's Key, which is an action puzzle game where you play a sorceress who can create or destroy blocks to help clear the 50 levels. It's considered really hard because of how easy it is to mess up on a level and have to start it all over. Following that, Taito puts out Arkanoid. A port of their Breakout clone arcade game is actually one of the best Breakout games this early on, but the NES version is notable for being bundled with a special controller. It had a dial similar to the Atari 2600 paddles or Breakout arcade machines that made it much easier to play. After that, we get Athena, a port of SNK's arcade platformer that was only released in Japan. It's one of the first anime-style games on the NES, and it's kind of comparable to the Wonder Boy games. The game involves breaking blocks to find power-ups which you need to keep your character strong enough to get through the game's challenges. It's mostly known now though because of the descendants of the main character have ended up in several King of Fighters games. After that, The Legend of Kage. Taito puts out a decent side-scrolling action platformer set in Japan with a lot of verticality as you control a ninja that can jump very high. It's a ton of fun and plays very differently from a lot of other NES action platformers, definitely something worth looking at. Next up, a game that's one of the biggest on the console, the original Metroid, which I can't believe I don't have the box for, but I'll have to fix that soon. I am actually not a big fan of the original Metroid. I find the level layouts overly complex, and I just have a lot of issues with the gameplay. But obviously, it's a huge classic and lays the groundwork for the later games, some of which are the best games ever made. The original Metroid has you controlling the sci-fi bounty hunter Samus Aran, who goes to a planet to take out the space pirates' head base. There she encounters series staples characters Ridley, Kraid, Mother Brain, and the Metroids. Gameplay involves traversing around the maze-like planet, searching for new weapons, upgrades, and the paths to the bosses. It also featured an extremely long password system. Most notably, the game rewards the player for beating it quickly with the reveal that under her suit, Samus is actually a woman, one of the first prominent female protagonists in gaming. In case I miss it later too, it's also worth noting that aside from the standard grey label design, a later Classic Series re-release of the game included a more colorful yellow box, manual, and label. After that is Elevator Action, an action puzzler with a stealth mindset, as the whole point of the game is to use the elevators to get through a 30-story building, avoiding or taking out enemies. Which brings us to the start of one of Nintendo's biggest franchises, definitely their biggest after Mario, The Legend of Zelda. Yeah, this is another amazing game by superstar designer Miyamoto. The Legend of Zelda kind of popularized the console action RPG genre, even though it's not really an RPG. The game evolves the kind of gameplay seen in Atari's Adventure and does away with some of the RPG mechanics of early PC action RPGs from around that time. The game takes place in the land of Hyrule and stars Link, a boy who goes on a journey to find the 8 pieces of the Triforce to save the Princess Zelda from the invading Ganon. It's a top-down action-adventure game where you traverse the overworld, defeating enemies, earning rupees to purchase items, and exploring caves and dungeons. The game features 8 dungeons, which are maze-like areas filled with basic puzzles. Each dungeon contains a new weapon or tool that allows Link to defeat enemies or interact with the world in different ways, uncovering new paths. Overall, it's considered one of the best games on the console, an amazing study in game design, and spawned one of the biggest and best series of all times. It's also the first NES game to include a battery that allowed the player to save their progress on the cart, as well as the first non-standard cart design featuring a goldish cart instead of the standard grey. Like Metroid, much later in the NES's life cycle, a Classic Series re-release would see the game on a standard grey cart. That version is more rare than the original. Following that, we got the 3D Battles of World Runner, or just 3D World Runner as I like to call it. A very cool shooter by Squaresoft in the vein of Space Harrier. The game stars the character Jack, who moves through 8 levels, taking out enemies, dodging obstacles, and leaping over pits. The game included a pair of 3D glasses and could be played in 3D mode, which was a neat addition. After that is Raid on Bungling Bay, a top-down helicopter game where you have to bomb enemy bases. It's best known as being the first game developed by Will Wright, who would go on to make The Sims and SimCity. After that, Spy Hunter, a port of Bally Midway's never-ending top-down driving game that has the player in their spy car pursued by enemies. Certain segments also have the player transfer into a boat. And after that, Deadly Towers, an almost Zelda-like action-adventure RPG that ends up being a decent game, but many people couldn't get past the very difficult and confusing early parts to enjoy it. And a sports game after that, Double Dribble, a port of Konami's 5-on-5 basketball, is possibly the best basketball game of the time. The game featured 4 fictional teams based on real cities, and is one of the first games to have cutscenes and voices. Then we get to Lode Runner, a port of the popular puzzle platformer that has the player moving through each of the game's 50 levels, in which they must collect all the gold before being able to move on to the next one. This port featured updated graphics over the original release and included the level editor. That was a big deal on the home computer releases, though there was no way to save your levels on the NES version. Some quick ones after that, Ring King, a port of Data East's arcade boxing game, and Sky Kid, a port of the Namco arcade horizontal shoot 'em up. Then we get to Spelunker, a cave diving platforming adventure game that doesn't get much love over here but was a big hit in Japan. So much so that they still make games in the series to this date. The game has the player dealing with enemies and using dynamite and keys to progress through 6 stages of a cave to find the treasure at the bottom. And now we can really discuss the Family Fun Fitness saga. Starting with the upcoming release, Stadium Events, the rarest NES game. The game itself features 4 track events, including the 100-meter dash, 110-meter hurdles, long jump, and triple jump. As it goes, Bandai was going to put out Stadium Events to go on the Family Fun Fitness pad, but Nintendo struck a deal with them to rebrand and re-release the Family Fun Fitness pad as the Power Pad, and so Bandai stopped selling Stadium Events. It's unclear why the game is so rare. It's come out that Nintendo didn't actually tell Bandai to recall the games as was previously thought, so it's just that they didn't ship many, I guess. There are very few out there, I think less than 20. People know where all of them are at this point. They are worth a ton. There are very few complete in box, but those are worth a ridiculous amount. Just a crazy game that's worth a ton. We'll talk more about that when we get to the release of next year's Power Pad. There's a really interesting kind of twist to that stadium events rarity, but for now let's move on to the next game, which I do have in my collection, Konami's Stinger. This is a Q-'em-up, which is actually the second game in the Twin B series. It's kind of a precursor to the Proteus series. Like Sega's Fantasy Zone, the game is a horizontal shoot-'em-up with bright graphics and cute enemies, but Stinger uses a more traditional shooter level structure. Definitely worth checking out since we didn't get any of the Proteus games over here. A couple quick ones to burn through after that, starting with Squoon, a horizontal shoot-'em-up where the player controls a submarine to take out enemies and their bases while rescuing trapped humans. Star Voyager, a first-person space shooter where you warp to different subspaces looking for weapons and upgrades to help take out the enemy fleets. Tiger Heli, a port of Taito's arcade vertical shoot-'em-up where you fly a helicopter and a precursor to Twin Eagle. Winter Games, one of Epic's Olympic-style games. This one includes 8 winter events. And that brings us to the second Squaresoft release after 3D World Runner, Rad Racer, which if you've seen The Wizard, you know all about. This is a racer a lot like Sega's Outrun. It's actually still pretty fun to play and my favorite racing game for this generation. The game doesn't do much new for the genre, but it's just a solid example of the behind-the-car racing game from this era. One cool aspect is that, like 3D World Runner, the game came with 3D glasses and had a 3D mode. And following that, a notorious sports, or maybe rhythm game, depending on who you ask, Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! Nintendo's big boxing franchise was inspired by their arcade game Punch-Out!, but is best known for this NES version. The game stars Little Mac going up against a number of big boxers, leading up to the title match with Mike Tyson himself. If you haven't played the game before, it's a fun, almost rhythm-based boxing game where you can block, dodge, do low and high punches to your opponent's left or right sides, and a super punch. The main goal is to figure out your opponent's patterns, to stay on your feet and then knock them out. The game is still a ton of fun, although it gets very difficult. It's definitely worth checking out if you avoided it, thinking it was a standard boxing game. More quick ones after that, Alpha Mission, a vertical shoot-'em-up by SNK, where standard weapons hit aerial enemies and missiles take out ground targets. You can also collect different power armors to equip which change up your ship. Lunar Pool, an interesting combination of billiards and mini-golf that plays like a pool game with uniquely shaped tables. And Xanac, a tough vertical shoot-'em-up with some unique aspects that make it one of the most hardcore shoot-'em-ups on the console. Which brings us to another really interesting Konami game, The Goonies 2. The first Goonies game was released only on Famicom, so the title may be a bit weird, but since the game also tries to be a sequel to the original movie, it still works. The game stars Mikey trying to save the remaining Goonies from the Fratelli family. Gameplay is a mix of side-scrolling platformer areas and first-person passages that connect them, making up a maze-like game structure where you have to find helpful weapons and items that allow you to reach your trapped friends. Following that is Breakthrough, a port of the Data East arcade game where you drive your armored dune buggy through 5 enemy bases. And after that we get 3 releases from a notorious NES publisher. LJN starts putting out games, and it's actually surprising that some of the LJN games were developed by Atlus, who's now best known for Shin Megami Tensei and Persona. The first is Gotcha the Sport, a shooting gallery paintball game very loosely based on the 1985 movie Gotcha, which I've never heard of before now. The game uses the Zapper, and LJN also had a line of Gotcha paintball guns and gear that you could buy from toy stores. Following that, Jaws, another mediocre licensed title from LJN, but I know this one has some fans. This one is based on the movie Jaws 4, and has you trying to take down the shark with your harpoon gun, submarine, and boat. And lastly, The Karate Kid, a frustrating action game from LJN based mostly on the second Karate Kid movie. Alright, a whole bunch of quick ones to get through after this. Starting with Kid Nicky Radical Ninja, a decent horizontal scrolling action platformer developed by IREM. Star Force, a port of the decent arcade vertical shoot-'em-up. Super Pitfall, Activision's first game published for Nintendo, is a terrible reimagining of Pitfall 2 that doesn't live up to the originals at all. And after that, another bad game, Top Gun, a notorious flight combat game based on the movie that's just really rough. Then Side Pocket, a good-for-the-time billiards game by Data East. And that brings us to the next game and last game I have for the year, Mega Man. In December of '87, the Blue Bomber launched on the NES. Not only the first Mega Man game, but Capcom's first console exclusive. The game introduced the world to Dr. Light, Roll, and Mega Man as they battle robots who've been turned against the humans by Dr. Wily. The game has 6 robot masters whose weapons can be absorbed by Mega Man when they're defeated, and each stage features the tough platforming challenges and enemies that Mega Man is known for. Like the later games, there's many modern ways to check out these games, but the original releases are still so highly sought after by collectors and go for a fair bit. Mega Man 1 itself is a fairly pricey title because it didn't sell as well as some of the later entries, so it's a bit more uncommon. And the last game for the year is Wizards and Warriors, the classic fantasy-themed action platformer that was developed by Rare. The game was known for its sprawling stages, which hid treasures and power-ups and had a lot of verticality. It was highly regarded at the time, and I know a lot of people really love this game, but in my opinion it was just janky enough around the edges in design and controls that it's pretty hard to pick up now if you weren't a fan back in the day. One other thing to mention, in December, US players got their first issues of the Nintendo Fun Club newsletter. This was a precursor to the Nintendo Power magazine, which went for 7 issues, one each month. And that's it for NES releases in 1987. Ton of stuff, some great stuff. Next year's looking good too, so I'm going to have that up soon. Stay tuned for that, and I'll see you guys later. Bye.